I'd have to say that it's not something that suddenly there's a bolt of lightning and, oh, we need to build an ark. When the Israelites conquered the promised land, it was little by little. And over the years, in a way, God has revealed to us little by little his calling on our life. When I'm talking about our life, I'm talking about myself and my wife. And, we just published a book actually called Miraculous, which is the whole story of the ministry. And so it was sort of little by little. I mean, I began as a science teacher in 1975. So this year, 2025, is my 50th anniversary of speaking on creation apologetics. And I spoke in a church actually. And the reason I did that is because of what was happening in the school. It was a little country town. And the first science class I had, the student said, "Sir, we heard you're a Christian, but how can you be a Christian when we know the Bible's not true?" And I said, "How do you know the Bible's not true?" "Because of what's in our textbooks about evolution and millions of years." And then a student piped up and he said, "And there's no way Noah could have got the animals on the ark." And I remember saying, "Well, how big was the ark?" Well, he didn't know. Well, how many animals? Well, he didn't know. But it couldn't have happened. It had to be a fairy tale because an unknown number of animals couldn't fit in an unknown size boat, a ship. And so I realized that these students needed some answers. And I started to teach them the answers. And then I thought, I was asked to speak in church and to do the sermon one Sunday. And I thought, these parents need to know what their kids are being taught in the public school, and I need to give them some answers as well. That was sort of the embryonic beginnings of it all. And then that was 1975. So then, while I was a school teacher during the next 5 years, I was taking students to museums and zoos, but they're always from an evolutionist perspective. And so it was really during that time I cried out to the Lord and said, "Why can't we have a creation museum? Why can't we have a museum that teaches them the truth?" And so that burden was with me back then. And it's something I can only explain as a fire in my bones, like Jeremiah talked about a fire in his bones. It's almost as if the Lord said, "You need to do something about this." In fact, it's really the impact of my parents and my father, who I would say had that Nehemiah righteous anger when he saw something that was wrong or an inconsistency in the church or compromise. He had that righteous anger. We've got to do something about that. And so it was that sort of righteous anger saying, "Wait a minute, we got to do something about this." And so it's been an interesting journey. So that was back in the 70s. In about 1980, I and a board member helped to start a ministry in our home that was to distribute books and to give teaching on creation apologetics. We stood on a piece of property and prayed that the Lord would let us build a creation museum. Now, that was in 1980, and the Lord answered that prayer in Northern Kentucky, in America, in 2007. And as a part of the Creation Museum, the main part of it is a walk through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And a part of that is going through the account of Noah and the ark. So it's an exhibit where we built 1% of the ark and answering some of those questions about the flood and fossils and natural selection and speciation and so on. And, we actually opened the Creation Museum in 2007. But in 2004, while we're building the Creation Museum, we talked about what are we going to do next? And I thought, well, the atheists often use the ark as an example of, the Bible is wrong. It can't be right because it says two of every kind of land, animal, seven pairs of some got on board the ark. There's no way they could fit. So we've heard that down through the years a lot. And actually, we used to have family camps where we would use helium balloons to try to show the size of the ark because we know that people didn't understand how big it was and how it could fit the animals on. And so really in 2004 we said, maybe we should think about building an ark. In 2005 we actually made the decision, you know what, once we get the Creation Museum built and opened, and we didn't even have all the money for that at that stage, but once we do that, let's look at the possibility of building a life-size ark so people actually see the size of it, and we answer those questions, and not just the question about how we could fit the land animal kinds on board the ark, but other questions about the flood as well. So now, that's just a very abridged version of the history, but it's been, little by little over the years. as the ministry has grown, as God has taught us things, and bringing the right people along at the right time, and experiences in talking to people and at conferences and so on, and building the Creation Museum first, which was the first vision that I had, but that then became the impetus for building the ark.